Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanao Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. This is working okay? Good. Welcome to our weekly Bhagavad Gita class. We continue our study on Chapter 6 on meditation. We'll begin with some recitation this morning, beginning with verse 26. And as always, as I'm chanting, look at the translation and then repeat after me. Yato yato nischalati, yato yato nischalati, manaschanchalamastiram, manaschanchalamastiram, tatastato niyam yaitad, tatastato niyam yaitad, atman yeva vasham nayet, atman yeva vasham nayet. Prashanta manasam hyenam, prashanta manasam hyenam, yoginam sukhamuttamam, yoginam sukhamuttamam, upaiti shanta rajasam, upaiti shanta rajasam, brahma bhutama kalmasham, brahma bhutama kalmasham, yunjan hevam saratmanam, yunjan hevam saratmanam, yogi vigata kalmashaha, yogi vigata kalmashaha, sukhena brahma samsparsham, sukhena brahma samsparsham, atyantam sukhamashnute, atyantam sukhamashnute, sarvabhutastamatmanam, sarvabhutastamatmanam, sarvabhutani chatmani, sarvabhutani chatmani, ikshate yoga yuktatma, ikshate yoga yuktatma, sarvatra samadarshanaha, sarvatra samadarshanaha, yo mam pashyati sarvatra, yo mam pashyati sarvatra, sarvam cha mayi pashyati, sarvam cha mayi pashyati, tasyaham na prapashyami, tasyaham na prapashyami, sachamena pranashyati, sachamena pranashyati, sarvabhutastitam yomam, sarvabhutastitam yomam, bhajatyekattvamastitaha, bhajatyekattvamastitaha, sarvatha vartamanopi, sarvatha vartamanopi, sayogi mayi vartate, sayogi mayi vartate. That's a good place to finish our chanting. And we ended the last class on verse 27. Just to pick up the thread here properly, the context. In verse 27, Sri Krishna very nicely described the mind of an advanced meditator, yogi, a mature meditator. Advanced, that word is not very nice. So a very well-practiced meditator. And that meditator's mind is described first as prashanta manasam. He's described as one whose mind is prashanta, quieted. Then in the third line, he's described as shanta rajasam, one for whom all the rajoguna, the principle of activity and passion, it has been shanta, it has been quieted, it has been removed. And in the final line, we have the word akalmasham. If you remember from the last class, I suggested that the word akalmasham means a mind free from tamas. So Shanta Rajasam in the third line, a mind free from Rajas, and Akalmasham in the final line, a mind free from Tamas. We're describing a mind which is sattvika, very pure. And in describing that very pure mind, I gave the example in the prior class, the famous example of a pond. If a pond has many ripples on top of it, you can't see what's on the bottom of the pond. The ripples, of course, represent rajas, rajoguna. And if the pond is full of dirt or pollution, you can't see what's on the bottom of the pond. That dirt or mud and pollution representing tamas. A pond that's perfectly still, a pond that's perfectly pure, free from impurities. That pond is perfectly transparent, clear. You can see right through that pond. And that's a metaphor for the mind of the well-practiced yogi, the well-practiced meditator, one who can make his or her mind so free from turbulence and free from impurity, that mind attains great transparency, so that whatever is your true nature shines forth unimpeded by the mind. And I have to make this warning once again. Every metaphor has a shortcoming, a defect, and that pond metaphor does have a big defect. And the defect is that when the pond is clear, you actually see something. Here, when the mind is as pure as that pond, you don't suddenly see something or have some unique experience. Books will write that Atma shines forth like 1,000 blazing suns. Nothing of the sort. Atma is already blazing forth right now, even in a state of ignorance. Atma is blazing forth like 1,000 blazing suns. So the clarity of the mind, that transparency of the mind, doesn't lead to a discovery of something new. It results in the recognition of that which has always been present, but covered. Your true nature, as Satchidananda Atma, is always present, but your true nature is covered, as it were, by the turbulence of the mind and the impurities of the mind. When the impurities and turbulence of the mind have been removed, when the mind is rendered transparent, your true nature shines through unimpeded by problems of the mind. Now, once again, when I say shining through, it doesn't mean you see the shining, because you are the shining. Do you follow that? This is a really important point. I say when the mind becomes transparent, Atma shines through, but you don't see that shining. You are that light of consciousness. Previously, the light of consciousness, which is your true nature, previously it was impeded by the agitation and impurities of your mind. Now, your light of consciousness shines unimpeded by the problems of the mind. And we concluded the class with that word Brahma Bhutam. This well-practiced yogi, meditator, it becomes Brahma Bhutam, literally becomes Brahman. And the commentator makes it clear it's not that you are, remember, it's not that you're transformed into Brahman. You discover Brahman as your already existent true nature. Better translation here, in fact, the translation here is good. You become identified with that Brahman. And the nature of that identification and what is Brahman and what does it mean to be identified by it is what's discussed in the next verse. So let us continue. Yunjan hevam sadatmanam, yunjan hevam sadatmanam, yogi vigata kalmashaha, yogi vigata kalmashaha, sukhena brahmasam sparsham, sukhena brahmasam sparsham, atyantam sukhamashnute, atyantam sukhamashnute. Starting with the second line. Yogi, our meditator, our very well-practiced meditator, who is vigata kalmashaha, as we saw in the prior verse, akalmasha. Here, vigata kalmasha, free from impurities. And that meditator, first line, yunjan evam, thus, yunjan. I translated here as meditating. This is my revised translation, and I have to revise my revised translation because even here there's a better translation. This translation is fine. It's true to the Sanskrit, but it's not in accordance with what the commentators indicate. So yunjan, instead of meditating, also has the meaning of controlling. So my translation earlier, yunjan evam sada always, atmanam, on atma, on your true self, always meditating. And that's a fine meaning, but it's not in keeping with the commentators. Better translation is to take yunjan not as meditating, but controlling. And you don't control Atma. Here, Atma means mind, as it does in so many verses. So, yunjan Atmanam, controlling the mind, evam, thus, in this manner. When? Sada, continually controlling the mind in this manner. Then what? Last line, end. That well-practiced meditator, last word, ashnute, gains, enjoys. What does he or she gain or enjoy? Atyantam sukham. Sukham, happiness, which is atyantam. Often translated as supreme. But here, supreme, the word supreme doesn't refer to a degree of happiness. Remember, we've had this discussion several times that where everyone is, there's a tendency to translate this as extreme bliss and an experience of unexcelled bliss. And we've made this observation so many times. If you experience unexcelled bliss in meditation, that bliss is a phenomenon occurring in your mind. It's not your true nature. Your true nature is the one observing that bliss. So we are not describing or talking about a blissful experience, but rather we're talking about the word in the expression Satchit Ananda. That word ananda does not mean an extraordinary blissful experience. That word ananda is revealing the nature of you, the experiencer. Not an experience, but an experiencer. So therefore, atyanta sukham cannot mean extreme bliss or happiness, but that word atyanta can also have the sense of something which is more fundamental. Suppose it doesn't exactly mean fundamental, it does mean extreme. But suppose you interpret that word as not extreme in terms of magnitude, but extreme in terms of being fundamental. Then atyantam sukham means a fundamental sukha, fundamental happiness, and it's a reference to your true nature as ananda, that ananda being the source of happiness. Not the experience of happiness, but the inner source from which all experiences of happiness arise. That's Ananda. Ananda is that inner source from which all experiences of happiness arise. So this meditator, Ashnute, enjoys, discovers that atyantam sukham, that fundamental source of happiness, which is further described as, in the third line, as Brahma samsparsham. Very interesting term. Samsparsham means contact with. And so here, contact with Brahman, this fundamental source of happiness, your true nature, Satchidananda Atma, is here described by Sri Krishna as Brahma samsparsham. You are in contact with Brahman. By being in contact with that inner source of happiness, you are simultaneously in contact with Brahman. Our definition of Brahman is the absolute reality, the fundamental, the substratum, because of which everything exists. Absolute existence, absolute reality, Brahman. So what Sri Krishna is saying here is quite profound. In meditation, when you are in contact with your true inner self, Satchidananda Atma, which is atyantam sukham, the source of happiness, you are simultaneously Brahma samsparsham, in contact with Brahman, this absolute reality, simultaneously because they're one and the same thing. This is the highest teaching of Vedanta. That is to say that the reality because of which you exist, your essential self, essential reality, Satchidananda Atma, is identical to the reality because of which the cosmos exists. It's not that complicated. The reality because of which you exist as a conscious being, and the reality because of which the entire cosmos exists, they can't be two different things. It has to be the one same reality because of which you exist as a conscious being, because of which the universe exists, and that one fundamental reality we can call Atma from one perspective or Brahman from another perspective, the same reality referred to in two different contexts. From the context of the individual person, we can call that reality Atma. From the context of the universe, we call that same reality Brahman. It is the one same reality. As I said, this is the highest teaching of Vedanta. When the scripture says, Tat Tvam Asi, you are that, it's exactly what it's saying. Tvam, you, your essential nature as Satchidananda Atma, you are Tat, that Brahman, that fundamental reality because of which everything in the cosmos exists. So really speaking, these last two lines amount to a Mahavakya. Sri Krishna is teaching here, Tattvam Asi. When you gain contact with that true inner self, that contact is Brahma Samsparsham. That contact is contact with the reality because of which everything exists, contact with Brahman. And one more word he adds here. So this well-practiced meditator, Ashnute, gains this Brahma samsparsham, contact with Brahman, how Sri Krishna says, oh, sukhena, easily. Now, I'm smiling because there's something a little ironic here. Because this well-practiced meditator has probably been practicing for years and years or decades, and with the help of the teachings of Vedanta, has discovered this truth, the truth expressed by the Mahavakya Tat Tvam Asi, then how can Sri Krishna say Sukhena Ashnute? He gains it, he or she gains that Brahma samsparsham, gains contact with Brahman, gains it Sukhena easily. It's ironic. Easily because it's always been there. Brahman has always been present as the reality because of which you exist. You don't have to reach Brahman. You are that Brahman. You always have been that Brahman. To reach where you are, how hard is it to reach the place where you currently are? Doesn't take any effort. How much effort does it take to become who you already are? Doesn't take any effort. So here, sukhena, effortlessly recognizing your true nature. Very nicely said. Let's continue. Sarvabhutasthamatmanam, sarvabhutasthamatmanam, sarvabhutani chatmani, sarvabhutani chatmani, ikshate yoga yuktatma, ikshate yoga yuktatma, sarvatra samadarshanaha, sarvatra samadarshanaha. Here, Sri Krishna begins to describe the consequence of this recognition. The recognition that the reality because of which you exist is the same as the reality because of which the universe exists. That recognition, that understanding, that spiritual wisdom has tremendous consequences, which Sri Krishna begins to describe in verse 29. Start in the third line. Ikshate yoga yukta atma. So our meditator is described here as yoga yukta atma. And once again, atma means mind. So this compound word means one whose atma, one whose mind is yukta, joined, engaged in meditation, united with reality through the practice of yoga, through the practice of meditation. Very nice expression. One whose mind is engaged, you can take it as one whose mind is engaged in meditation. That's a very straightforward meaning as well. Yoga yukta atma, one whose atma, mind, is yukta, engaged in yoga, meditation. So we're talking about, again, not our beginning meditator, but our very well-practiced meditator. That well-practiced meditator, ikshate, literally sees, but be careful here about the use of the word see. Frequently, just like we do in English, we use the word, not English, Hindi, other languages as well. We use the word see when we mean know. If I ask you, do you see what I mean? You don't see a meaning. So we commonly use that word to see in the sense of to know. That's true in other languages as well, and it certainly is true here. So yoga yuktatma, our advanced meditator, engaged in meditation, ikshate, sees, means understands, discovers, recognizes, realizes, any of those words. Realizes what? Go up to the first line. Realizes or recognizes sarva bhutastam atmanam. Realizes the atmanam, the true self, which is sarva bhutastam, bhutastam, abiding in being, sarva, all beings. So that atma that abides in all beings, so that when you look within yourself, you recognize your true nature as consciousness, chaitanya, chit. And further, you recognize that the consciousness, which is your essential nature, is not stuck inside your head, is not stuck inside your body. The consciousness which abides within you is in fact boundaryless, limitless, and therefore all pervasive. We've had this discussion many times. There is one all-pervasive Atma, consciousness, which then becomes manifest or reflected wherever there's a sentient being. All pervasive consciousness is manifest here. It's manifest in you. It's manifest in every living sentient being. That same one Atma, same one consciousness. So here we're talking about the advanced, I want to avoid that word advanced meditator. And the reason I don't, somehow it doesn't sound right. It sounds like you have testing and you can achieve different levels. It's not the right word to use. So our well-practiced meditator who has become enlightened. So that enlightened meditator, there we go. That's a much better expression. Pardon me? Skillful meditator. My assistant says skillful meditator is also fine. That skillful meditator. Here, why don't we stay with enlightened meditator? So that enlightened meditator, ikshate, sees sarva bhutastam atmanam, sees that one all-pervasive consciousness manifest in all beings. That's one side of the equation, so to speak, because look at the other side in the next line. Sarva bhutani cha atmani. Cha. And atmani, in atma, sarva bhutani, all creatures. Now we lose the meaning in all these words. One, I'll paraphrase, one who sees consciousness, Atma, one who sees Atma in all beings and sees all beings in Atma. That's actually a very accurate translation. One who sees Atma in all beings and sees all beings in Atma. How do you see all beings in Atma? Two ways. One is, we said before, Atma is all-pervasive consciousness, so therefore everything that exists is within that all-pervasive consciousness. But here the context is more profound than that. That's already quite profound. But what Sri Krishna is referring to here, when he says Atmani, he's referring not to individual consciousness. He's referring to Brahman. So let me substitute a word here to make more sense out of this. One who sees Atma in all beings, and one who sees all beings in that Atma which is Brahman. One who sees all beings in Brahman. To see all beings in Brahman is to recognize Brahman as the underlying reality because of which everything exists. It's like to see pot in the clay. This is our metaphor. You can see pot in clay If I had 100 pots, you'd have 100 pots you could see in one clay. Here, the second line is seeing sarva bhutani, all beings, all that exists, to see them in one underlying reality. That one underlying reality can be called Atma from an individual standpoint. That same underlying reality can be called Brahman from the ultimate, from a cosmic standpoint. This may be confusing if you're hearing this for the first time, but Atma is Brahman. These are not two different realities, as I said in a prior verse. One reality from two perspectives. From the perspective of the universe, the underlying reality we call Brahman. From the perspective of the individual, the underlying reality we call Atma. It's the same reality. One of the four famous Mahavakyas, we keep quoting Tattvamasi, but an equally important Mahavakya is Ayam Atma Brahma. This Atma is Brahman. This is found in the Mandukya Upanishad. This Atma, the consciousness because of which you exist, is Brahman, the reality because of which everything else exists. So don't be surprised when you see the words Atma and Brahman apparently superimposed on each other. They really describe one reality from two different perspectives. So, Yoga Yuktatma, our skillful meditator, our enlightened meditator, sees all beings, sees Atma in all beings, sees all beings in Atma, and the last line summarizes it. This enlightened meditator, Ikshate, sees sarvatra, last line, sees everywhere, sees who is seeing samadarshanaha, the one who sees all things as being the same. This is a big statement. To recognize there is one reality manifest as the entire universe, the same one reality manifest as you and I. From that highest standpoint, there is only that one reality. Whether you look inside, you see that one reality. You look outside and you appreciate the truth of that one reality. If you look within, if you look outside, you appreciate that one reality. This is called samadarshana, seeing this darshana, seeing sama, the sameness, seeing the sameness of all. There's another famous Vedic statement that describes a sarvam kalvidam brahma. This comes from Chandogya Upanishad. Sarvam idam, all this, all that exists, kalu indeed, all this is Brahman. There is only Brahman. There is nothing but Brahman. If you look inside, Brahman. If you look outside, Brahman. There is nothing other than Brahman. There is only Brahman. Sarvam kalvidam brahma. All this is nothing but Brahman. This is called here samadarshanaha. And that's explained further. Let's see that. Yo mam pashyati sarvatra, yo mam pashyati sarvatra, sarvam cha mai pashyati, sarvam cha mai pashyati, tasyaham na prapashyami, tasyaham na prapashyami, sacha me na pranashyati, sacha me na pranashyati. The first half of this verse will give you a sense of what it is to be enlightened. So that Sri Krishna describes what it's like to be enlightened. And he says, Yaha, one who, that enlightened one, Yaha, is one who pashyati, sees what? Mam, me. Sri Krishna speaks here. The enlightened one is one who sees me sarvatra, everywhere. The enlightened one sees me, Sri Krishna, everywhere. In the next line, sarvam cha, and everything, pashyati, he sees mayi, in me. An enlightened one sees me everywhere and sees everything in me. Now, to understand this at all, we first have to understand when Sri Krishna says me, he's not referring to himself as Arjuna's charioteer. He's not even referring to himself as an avatara of Lord Vishnu. Here, Sri Krishna is referring to himself as Brahman. How can Sri Krishna refer to himself as Brahman? Well, Sri Krishna is enlightened. So an enlightened person is one who knows my true nature is Brahman. Another one of our 4 famous Mahavakyas is Aham Brahmasmi. Aham, I, Brahma Asmi, I am Brahman. Another one of the 4 Mahavakyas. Sri Krishna knows I am Brahman. From that perspective, he says the enlightened person is one who sees sarvatra, everywhere, he sees me. Not Sri Krishna, as an individual, sees Brahman everywhere. The enlightened person looks out and sees nothing but Brahman, like we quoted from the Chandogya Upanishad. Sarvam kalvidam brahma. All this is nothing but Brahman. So the enlightened person looks out and sees there is nothing but Brahman. Or if the enlightened person looks within, the enlightened person sees nothing but Brahman. Sarvam cha mayi pashyati. The enlightened person sees everything in Brahman, meaning everything exists because of an underlying reality called Brahman. Does it mean that the enlightened person loses contact with reality as we know it? This is a confusion that sometimes arises. The enlightened person only sees Brahman. That means the enlightened person doesn't see trees and sun and moon and other things. No. An enlightened person only sees clay. Of course, he or she perceives a pot, but the enlightened person never, ever loses sight of the fact that this object is nothing but clay. You can set an enlightened person aside here. From a normal worldly perspective, if you know this object is nothing but clay, can you still use it as a pot? Why not? Both are true from 2 different perspectives. From a worldly perspective, from a transactional, a relational perspective, certainly we can call this a pot. But from a fundamental perspective, there's no pot at all. We've had this discussion before, long ago. There's no pot here at all. There's only clay. Remember that discussion? We said pot is not a thing. Pot is an idea, a concept. Pot is name and form, nama and rupa. This object is 4 ounces of clay. How much does the pot add to those 4 ounces? That's my point. Potness doesn't add anything to the clay. Really speaking, there's nothing but clay. But here, the point is, from one perspective, there's nothing but clay. From another perspective, hand me the pot. An enlightened person can effortlessly handle these two perspectives. That is to say, from one perspective, there's nothing but Brahman. From another perspective, give me a cup of tea. How's that? And these two perspectives don't negate one another, because they're from different levels of reality. From an absolute level of reality, there's nothing but Brahman. From an empirical level of reality, we have a world of duality in which we live. So Sri Krishna says the enlightened person is one who has this vision. There is nothing but Brahman. Everything exists in Brahman, having Brahman as its underlying reality. Last half of the verse, tasya, for that enlightened meditator, aham, I, na pranashyami. Pranashyami literally means to be, I am not destroyed, pranashyami. And it's used here in a figurative sense. Sri Krishna is not going to be destroyed. Brahman, he's talking about himself as Brahman. So Brahman is not available for destruction. Brahman is that because of which everything exists. So here we have to take pranashyami figuratively. I've translated here as absent. So tasya, for that enlightened person, aham, I. Remember here Sri Krishna is speaking from the standpoint of Brahman. Why don't we substitute it? Tasya, for the enlightened person, aham, I, meaning Brahman, na pashyami, na pranashyami, is not absent. I'm paraphrasing now, for the enlightened person, Brahman is never absent. Sacha me na pranashyati, and Sri Krishna says, me, for me, for Brahman, saha, that enlightened meditator, na pranashyati, is not destroyed, figuratively speaking, not absent. So I'll paraphrase both of these. And instead of referring to Sri Krishna, since Sri Krishna has already referred to himself as Brahman, I'm going to substitute the word Brahman here. And as I paraphrase the last half of this verse, Sri Krishna says, tasya, for that enlightened meditator, Brahman is never absent, and saha, that enlightened meditator, for Brahman is never absent from Brahman. Brahman is never absent from the meditator. The meditator is never absent from Brahman. So that's my attempt to paraphrase here, the idea being there's only Brahman. How can you speak of presence or absence or separation? It's impossible. All right. Then. Sarvabhutastitam yo mam, sarvabhutastito yo mam, bhajatyekattvamastitaha, bhajatyekattvamastitaha, sarvata vartamanopi, sarvata vartamanopi, sayogi mai vartate, sayogi mai vartate. Oh, this is very important. That yo is yaha, one who, beginning of the second line, bhajati. We have to break the words apart. Bhajati, ekatvam, astitaha. So right now we just need the word bhajati. Bhajati, worships. Yaha, one who, bhajati, worships. Worships whom? Back up. Mam, me. Sri Krishna speaks in the first person. Yaha mam bhajati, one who worships me, sarva bhuta sthitam. Sthitam, abiding in sarva, all, bhuta, all creatures, all existence. One who worships me in all that exists, in all beings. End of the second line, ekatvam astitaha, that one who is astitaha, established in ekatvam, oneness, the oneness of reality. One who is established in the oneness of reality, who worships me, Sri Krishna, one who worships Sri Krishna, sarva bhutastitam. And that word is really important because it addresses a common problem. And the problem is many pious people worship God in various ways. They worship God on the altar. They worship God in their prayers. They worship God in various forms. But here, Sri Krishna is pointing to the reality that Sri Krishna abides not. Sri Krishna is not present only on an altar. Sri Krishna is present in every single being. So you can see the hypocrisy here of someone who worships Sri Krishna on a form on the altar, and that same person is unable to appreciate Sri Krishna's presence in another human being. I want to show you our altar. Here. And you can see my hand here. So here is Sri Krishna standing nicely on our altar. So imagine someone who goes and stands in front of that altar and prays to Sri Krishna and has so much devotion for Sri Krishna, but that same person is mean and ornery towards all human beings. There's hypocrisy here. Sri Krishna is not present merely in that form on the altar. Sri Krishna is present in every human being. In fact, you can even argue Sri Krishna is more present in a human being than in a stone form on the altar. Here's why. That stone form on the altar, before we can worship the stone form on the altar, we have to do a ritual called prana pratishta, part of the rituals of temple consecration. That is to say, we have to invoke Sri Krishna's presence in that form. Until and unless we invoke Sri Krishna's presence in that form is not suitable for worship. On the other hand, from the moment of birth, this one is already divine. Every human being, every living being is divine from birth. You don't have to do prana pratishta, invoke God's presence in a living being. That living being is divine from birth. So that's why I'm saying, in a manner of speaking, that human beings are a better manifestation of Sri Krishna than the form on the altar. I'm certainly not saying you shouldn't worship the form on the altar. The form on the altar has been consecrated and is a very beautiful focal point for worship. What I am saying is it's crucial that we avoid this particular kind of hypocrisy of directing our worship towards deities on the altar and losing sight of the fact that every human being, not just human being, every living being is a manifestation of deity, of that deity. So why not treat every human being with the same love and respect that you might give that deity on the altar? That's the message here. So, where am I? Sarva bhutastitam. Yaha mam bhajati. One who worships me, sarva bhutastitam, abiding in all beings. that one who is ekatvam astitaha, that one who is established in oneness, that one divinity manifest as all living beings, that one who sarvata vartamanaha api, in the third line, vartamanaha api, even while being engaged in the world in all different sarvata, in all manners, even while being engaged in all activities without losing sight of that divinity of the person you're dealing with. This is also quite important. There are plenty of times in life when we get irritated or angry or frustrated. And that irritation and anger and frustration has the unfortunate effect of shifting our perspective in a very unfortunate way. Here's a concrete example. Suppose you get it. That is to say that you recognize in your heart of hearts that all beings are fundamentally divine, and especially all human beings are fundamentally divine. Then, when you go to the market to buy something, and the person at the checkout register is making mistakes or not doing something wrong, doing something that irritates you, you might get angry at that worker in the market, and in that moment of anger, it's very easy to lose sight of the essential divinity of that person. Anger and frustration have a way of pulling a veil over our eyes, so to speak, and preventing us from seeing the divinity of that person. So here Sri Krishna says, sarvata, in all situations, vartamanaha api, while you are engaged in any and all situations, to never, ever lose sight of this truth, the truth of the fundamental divinity of every being. We're talking about an enlightened person. Saha, in the last line, saha yogi, that skillful meditator, that enlightened meditator, mayi vartate, Sri Krishna says, we're kind of poetically, that meditator literally abides in me. And of course, everyone and everything abides in mayi, in me, in that reality. But here Sri Krishna makes a special reference to this meditator. Earlier in the Bhagavad Gita, he said that one certain, or is it in chapter 12? I think in Sachame Priyaha, I think that's from chapter 12, where Sri Krishna says that some people are closer to him than others. And he uses that also in a figurative sense. He's using it here figuratively when he says that yogi abides in me. He says that one, that enlightened meditator, is especially close to me, because that enlightened meditator sees nothing but me. Me being Sri Krishna from the standpoint of Brahman. Once again, sarvam kalvidam brahma, the enlightened person sees all this is Brahman, or if you want to say Krishna, fine. All this is Krishna, means the same thing. All this is Krishna, all this is Brahman, all this is one underlying divine reality, and everything that exists is a manifestation of that reality. Everything that exists depending on that underlying reality. Okay. One more verse, we'll finish this topic. Atmaupam yena sarvatra sarvatra atmaupyam yena sarvatra samam pashyati Arjuna samam pashyati Arjuna sukham va yadi va dukkam sukham va yadi va dukkam sayogi paramo mataha sayogi paramo mataha. Start in the second line. Samam pashyati yaha Arjuna, O Arjuna, yaha, one who, and again, it says yo, but you know that I break all the words apart. You know that the spelling of these words changes at where two words come together. It's called sandhi. Sandhi means when two things touch. So when two words touch, there are grammatical changes called sandhi. So here, I am undoing those grammatical changes called sandhi. And you doing that, you come up with the words yaha, one who, and Arjuna. So Shri Krishna addresses, O Arjuna, yaha, one who, pashyati, sees, and again, sees not with the eyeballs, sees with the faculty of understanding. One who understands, one who recognizes. One who recognizes what? Samam, the same. The same underlying divine reality because of which everything exists. The one who, Brahman, the one who sees that underlying reality where, end of the first line, sees it sarvatra, everywhere. One who sees that fundamental reality everywhere, and a key word here is the first word, Atma aupamyena, sees outside the same way as you see inside. Aupamyena means similar to Atma, inside. One who sees the same reality outside and aupamyena sees it as being the same as when you look inside. And this really describes an enlightened meditator. An enlightened meditator closes his or her eyes and discovers that divinity within. And then when meditation is over, you open your eyes and you see the same divinity. It's actually very simple, very beautiful. Eyes closed, you recognize the divinity within. Eyes open, you recognize the same divinity everywhere. And with a little warning here. Sukham va yadi va dukkam. Whether what you see outside or inside, if it brings sukham va, if it brings happiness, yadi va dukkam, or if it brings pain or suffering. So here, so many times, you look inside, suppose you're depressed, or suppose you're experiencing physical pain. Both are possible. But depression is a condition of your mind. Physical pain belongs to your body. Depression belongs to your mind. Pain belongs to your body. What belongs to your true nature? Satchidananda Atma, your true nature as limitless consciousness, is utterly unaffected by the depression in your mind, utterly unaffected by the pain in your body. It makes no difference. When you look inside, whether there's sukha or dukkha, happiness or pain, pleasure or pain, doesn't make any difference. Similarly, when you look outside, if you see something very beautiful or something very ugly, sukham or dukkham, it doesn't make any difference. Whether it looks beautiful or if it looks ugly, it is that same underlying divinity because of which everything exists. Important to apply this also to people. We have this tendency to categorize people into two categories. One category, people I like. The other category, people I don't like. Of course, the third category is people I don't know. But amongst people you do know, the people you do know are in one category or other. Those that I like and those that I don't like. Both are equally manifestations of the same divinity. So Sri Krishna says here, Sukham va yadi va dukham. Whether you see someone you love or whether you see someone you have a long, painful history with, a person who has caused you great suffering, when you can appreciate the same divinity of a loved family member and someone else who has abused you in various ways, when you recognize the identical divinity of both, then Saha Yogi, last line, Saha Yogi, that enlightened meditator, Paramaha Mataha. Mataha is considered Paramaha, the best. One who can see the same divinity inside, see the same divinity outside, and see that same divinity unconditionally in the presence of pain and suffering, unconditionally recognizing that divinity. Such a person, Mataha, is considered the Paramaha, the highest of all yogis. So before we conclude, just to leave you with a final thought, think about the people in your life that you tend to categorize. I like these people and I don't like these people. And then reflect for just a moment on the fact that those that you dislike are equally manifestations of the divine as those that you like. This perspective will challenge the way you think. We fall into comfortable patterns, categorizing all the people in our life. But the moment you bring in this wonderful teaching, it challenges us to go further. We may have negative emotions towards certain people. Happens, normal. But this teaching challenges us to go beyond those negative emotions to the extent that you can recognize in that person who has hurt you, in that person who has abused you, that person is equally a manifestation of the divine. When you gain that perspective, you can be like that Sahayogi, that enlightened meditator who is Mataha Paramaha, who is considered the best of all. Okay, we'll conclude here. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat.